There is nothing worse than a brilliant hit video game coming out and you not having the hardware to run it. Well, maybe murder, but it's close. So in theory, it's a good thing when that brilliant game is ported onto a less powerful machine, giving more people the opportunity to enjoy it. In practice though, these ports can be downright travesties, bearing as much resemblance to the original game as I do to Dwayne The Rock Johnson. See? I can't even do the eyebrow thing. Anyway, consider these 7 worst ports of legendary games and contemplate the difference. Enjoy!
Back in the day, an arcade wasn't really an arcade unless it contained a Final Fight cabinet. I mean, obviously it was an arcade, it just wouldn't have been a good one. Final Fight is excellent, is what I'm trying to say. And although Final Fight wasn't the first ever beat-em-up, it was one of the first to really nail the formula, setting the tone for other classics of the genre like Streets of Rage, The Simpsons, and a bit further down the line, the Scott Pilgrim game. There was just one problem. Being an arcade machine designed to make players die regularly, Final Fight ate through coins like one of those money-counting machines you get at the supermarket. So what players needed was a home version they could play over and over without having to cough up cash every time. The version of Final Fight for the SNES looked like it might be just the thing until it became clear this port was missing more important stuff than me walking into Batman Begins 20 minutes late. Why don't Batman's parents ever call him? No wonder he's like that. Because the SNES could only handle a really limited number of sprites, and because the characters in Final Fight were big and chunky, you could only fight up to 2 enemies at once. Compare that to the original arcade game, where you battled excitingly through up to 10 baddies at a time. Even worse, because of these hardware limitations, Capcom removed the game's 2-player mode altogether, along with an entire stage and, devastatingly, one of the 3 original playable characters, Guy. He's the best one, apart from Hagar. Following fan outrage, publisher Capcom followed up with a special version on the SNES called Final Fight Guy. But it turned out that was just as bad because it was still the same single-player game as before, with all the same missing stuff, except it added Guy by removing Cody. He's the best one! Apart from Hagar. I'm allowed to change my mind.
You've got to hand it to Capcom for redefining not only the beat-em-up and the one-on-one fighting genre, but also convincing kids that if you just get good enough at karate, you can do fireballs. And when you've got a game as groundbreaking and genre-defining as fireball-heavy arcade legend Street Fighter II, which rewrote the rules for practically every fighting game that followed, it stands to reason that everyone with a home console or computer at the time wanted their own version of it. Things started promisingly with the SNES port, which was so popular that it became the 2nd best-selling title on that machine, if you count sales from the Street Fighter II Turbo and Super editions as well. Have some of that, Final Fight Guy. Then things got ugly. Notorious port publisher US Gold got its hands on the rights to make Street Fighter II for home computers in Europe and started firing out grim mutant versions of the game like some sort of Darwinian blooper reel. The Amiga version looks closest to the arcade game, but its choppy frame rate made it hard to play and harder to love. Not to mention that it was controlled with a joystick that had a single fire button, as opposed to the 6 needed for proper street fighting. The Commodore 64 version looks even worse, with tiny sprites that made it look like the fighters had been stood at either end of a football pitch and told to meet each other for a fight on the halfway line. Finally, there's the port for the ZX Spectrum. With the Spectrum's humble 48 kilobytes of memory, this was never going to match up to the arcade version. And the opening message that, due to machine limitations, this version may differ from examples in the manual, is the first sign you're in for a bumpy ride. Sure enough, the single-colour graphics, the wild screen tearing, the one-button controls and the awful collision detection meant the Spectrum version of Street Fighter II is so far removed from the arcade version that actually going outside and punching the street is more authentic. And slightly less painful, actually.
Say, buddy, You mentioned something about research for a story.
That's right. Got a tip that something big's happening.
As long as you can move slightly faster than zombie speed, a single zombie is basically zero threat. One could get into the studio right now and I'd still have 15 minutes to finish this video and then could just walk around him on my way to the exit. Loads of time. This is why zombies come in hordes, and this is why when Dead Rising was originally released on the Xbox 360, it was praised for the ways in which it took advantage of the hardware's strengths, particularly the way it could handle so many zombies on screen at once. Set in an enclosed mall crammed full of zombies, Dead Rising felt like the Dawn of the Dead game you always dreamed of, and churning your way through seas of the undead was an absolute gore-soaked joy. 3 years later, however, Capcom announced that it was bringing a port of Dead Rising to the Wii, and fans were a little confused. How was Nintendo's standard def, modestly powered console going to turn out the same sort of experience as the Xbox 360? What magic trickery was Capcom going to pull off to get all those zombies on screen at once? Turns out the answer was no magic trickery, because Dead Rising, Chop Till You Drop, as the Wii port was known, wasn't so much a zombie version of Black Friday as it was a zombie version of a quiet Sunday morning before the shops open. While the 360 version could populate the screen with around 800 zombies at once, the Wii version dialed this back to just 100, made the shopping mall smaller, and removed the game's photography elements on top of that. Which was pretty annoying, since half the point was that you were playing as a photojournalist who has, he's at pains to remind you, covered wars.
I've covered wars, you know.
We do know, Frank, thanks. Capcom did add zombie parrots and zombie poodles to the port in an attempt to make up for the downgrade, but let's face it, when you have to utter the phrase, "Don't worry, we've added zombie poodles," you've already lost the argument.
More iconic and commercially successful than Stonehenge, PacMan is the greatest circle in the history of civilization. Changed my mind. Such was PacMan's enormous popularity in arcades that Atari knew it had to get a port on its Atari 2600 console. So a deal was done and programmer Todd Fry recreated it in 6 months. And when I say he recreated it, I mean in the same way that you can recreate the Mona Lisa by painting a smiley face on a watermelon. To put it simply, the Atari 2600 was in no way capable of handling PacMan. Not only did the console have 32 times less memory than the PacMan arcade board, but Atari also decided to use cheaper 4KB cartridges for the game, rather than the new 8KB ones that would have given Fry a bit more room to maneuver. The result was a mess of a game with a squashed up display, a blue background because Atari would only let you use a black one if you were making a space game, dots that looked more like frisbees, and some of the worst sprite flicker ever seen in a video game. Because the 2600 could only handle 2 character objects at the same time, and because PacMan famously features 5 characters, the game used one character to keep PacMan on the screen at all times, and used the other to alternate between displaying all 4 ghosts. This meant each ghost would only appear once every 4 frames, creating a huge flicker effect. The fact that it sold around 8 million copies, making it the best-selling Atari 2600 game ever, somehow made this PacMan port even more of a disaster, because the game was so rubbish that it affected players' confidence in Atari and made them hesitant to buy new Atari 2600 ports of their other favourite games. Still, at least they had some great original games like E.T. Bury the whole system in the desert, I would.
Optic flash.
XMen vs Street Fighter is a game where you can have a fight on equal footing between a man who is quite good at karate and a superpowered mutant who has eyes that shoot lasers.
X-Men vs Street Fighter!
It came about after publisher Capcom gave us 2 separate Marvel-themed fighting games in X-Men Children of the Atom and Marvel Superheroes, then decided to make a crossover game which combined Marvel's X-Men characters with its own Street Fighter characters. Rather than making this a straight one-on-one fighting game, Capcom added a tag fighting mechanic. Players had to choose 2 characters instead of just one and could switch between them during the fight, opening up an entirely new world of strategic possibility.
Yes, optic flash.
Like karate and eye lasers. The ultimate weapon. The crossover element and the tag battle mechanic were so well received that it eventually evolved into the much loved Marvel vs. Capcom series.
Geronimo, for Destroyer.
Hyper combo finish! KO!
Capcom initially announced that the X-Men vs. Street Fighter arcade game would be exclusively ported to the Sega Saturn, which made some kind of sense because the Saturn was far superior at handling 2D games, making it a natural home for a port of a Capcom fighting title. Capcom eventually did a U-turn on the Saturn's exclusivity and agreed to release the game on the PlayStation 1 as well. But when the PlayStation version arrived some months later, it was clear that the PS1 was a poor fit for this game. For starters, the memory limitations on Sony's console meant Capcom had to remove frames of animation for each character, making them move a little choppier. I know Wolverine is supposed to be choppy, but this is ridiculous. Far worse though was the decision to scrap the tag battling mechanic, turning the game into a standard one-on-one fighter. By ditching the thing that made X-Men vs. Street Fighter unique in the first place, the PlayStation version is generally known as one of the worst ports of a fighting game ever released. Like Cyclops' eye beams are generally known to be blasts of concussive force rather than lasers. Before you get at me in the comments.
Man, what a mess. What could have done this? What was that?
Remember the universally beloved opening of Resident Evil 2? Your desperate sprint through the burning, zombie-infested streets of Raccoon City trying to make it to safety, and how good it was? Now imagine if instead of that, it looked like this. Why, we'd have burned Capcom's offices to the ground. And we'd have been right to do it. That regrettable footage is from 1997, when Tiger Electronics released a website called Game.com.
It's actually a handheld console.
It's a handheld console? Then why is it called Game.com? The 90s were a ridiculous decade. Yes, the Game.com was a standalone handheld that took cartridges, and to its credit, it had a few ideas that were ahead of its time, like a touchscreen with a stylus and... okay, that's it. The problem was someone forgot to tell Tiger their new device ought to have improved hardware, so the Game.com screen was a horrendously ugly, unlit effort with the sort of blurry movement not seen since the machine's designer sprinted out of the door laughing with his big bag of cash. Working with an absolute lemon of a handheld, Tiger decided to make some really awful tasting lemonade with what it had, and started licensing more IPs to make titles for the Game.com. This is where Resident Evil 2 came in. Some maniac decided that it might just be possible to take Leon's story from the PlayStation 1 game and pop it onto a cartridge less than 1 megabyte in size. The result has to be seen to be believed, which is quite useful considering we do videos. On one hand, you have to salute the game's developer for putting something that very slightly resembles Resident Evil 2 on a handheld with the processing power of a bag of spinach. On the other hand, look at what they did to your boy Leon S. Kennedy. Look at him! I mean, I assume that's him.
Long before the likes of Virtua Racing and Ridge Racer were blowing people away with 3D racing, Hard Drive-In was a 1989 arcade game which offered one of the first fully 3D tracks that players could drive freely around. It was exciting at the time, I expect. Its 1990 sequel, Race Drive-In, offered more of the same good stuff, and both games were popular enough to warrant ports to home consoles. You may be thinking that 8-bit and 16-bit systems would have struggled to handle these games, given that this was back in the day of mainly sprite-based gaming, but most of them, including the Amiga, the Mega Drive and PC, didn't do a terrible job. Then there was the 1992 SNES port. The Super FX chip that was used to make polygonal games on the SNES was still a good 9 months away from release, so developer Imagineering had to make do with what it had. And apparently, what it had was a piece of cardboard and some crayons. The SNES version of Race Drive-In was abysmal, mainly because the frame rate was comically low compared to any of the other versions. Sure, plenty of early polygonal games suffered from shonky frame rates, but Race Drive-In on the SNES updated its image at such a low rate that once you picked up speed, it became basically unplayable. of thumb, when your port stops looking like a racing game and starts looking like a slideshow of your trip to the local rectangle factory, it's time to send it to the junkyard.
Hey, thanks so much for watching this video about the worst ports in video game history.
Zombie.
Yeah, I mean, it's still a good 10 feet away. I can probably finish the outro. Anyway, if you want to watch another video, why not check out this one up here, not for zombies, anti-zombie video, this one. Or down here, check out a video from Outside Extra, our sister channel. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm going to very slowly juke around this zombie and out the door. Thanks for watching, bye!